Caleb Mercer was 18 years old the day he walked out of the county foster home for the last time. Everything he owned fit inside one worn-out backpack, two t-shirts, a pair of jeans, and a letter that made no sense at all. The letter came from a law firm in downtown Seattle. It said he was required to attend the reading of a will. The will belonged to Arthur Whitmore, the billionaire whose name was stamped on half the skyscrapers in the city. Caleb had never met the man. As far as he knew, he had no family left. Nobody. But the letter came with a bus ticket and an address on the 42nd floor of a glass tower overlooking the bay. So he went. The office looked like something out of a movie. Marble floors, quiet assistants in tailored suits, windows that stretched from the floor all the way to the ceiling. Caleb suddenly became very aware of the scuffed sneakers on his feet. He sat down at a long table full of strangers. The lawyer began to read. One by one, the fortune was handed out. Properties, shares, millions of dollars, all of it going to one man. And then the lawyer turned to Caleb, slid a small envelope across the table. "To Caleb Mercer," he said evenly, "Mr. Whitmore leaves $1." The room went quiet. Then somebody laughed. Caleb stared at the single-dollar bill inside. He had no idea it would change everything. The man who laughed was sitting at the head of the table. Silver hair, tailored gray suit, a watch that probably cost more than every car in the foster home parking lot combined. He had the easy smile of a man who had never once worried about money. Vincent Whitmore. Caleb didn't need anyone to tell him the name. The resemblance to the photos in the building lobby was right there in the jaw, the posture, the way he owned the room without trying. Vincent laughed again, softer this time, almost kind, which somehow made it worse. $1, Vincent said. He shook his head amused. Well, the old man always did have a sense of humor. A few of the other strangers chuckled along, polite, the way people laugh when the boss laughs. Caleb said nothing. He looked down at the dollar bill in the envelope. It was old, creased soft at the folds. The kind of bill you might get as change at a gas station and never look at twice. Something hot rose up in his chest. Not anger exactly, something older than anger. The feeling he'd carried his whole life sitting in waiting rooms, standing in donation lines watching other kids get picked first. The feeling of being the leftover. The one nobody counted. He had practiced swallowing that feeling for 18 years. So he swallowed it now. He folded the dollar bill in half, then in half again, slid it carefully into the inside pocket of his thin jacket. The pocket right over his heart, though he didn't think about it that way at the time. Then he stood up. The chair scraped against the marble, loud in the quiet room. Everybody looked at him. "Thank you for your time," Caleb said. His voice didn't shake. He made sure of that. And he walked out. Behind him, 42 floors above the city, a fortune was still being divided. Bank accounts, office towers, a name that meant something. And Caleb walked out with $1. The rain had started while he was inside. Seattle does that. Gray all morning, then the sky just opens quiet and cold. No thunder, no warning. Caleb stepped out of the glass tower and the water hit him right away. Soaked through his thin jacket in about a minute. He pulled it tighter anyway. Old habit, as if the gesture itself could keep him warm. The street was full of people who knew where they were going. Umbrellas, taxis, a man in a long coat barking into his phone about a deal that couldn't wait. Headlights smeared yellow across the wet pavement. Caleb walked. He didn't have an umbrella. He didn't have taxi money. He had a bus ticket for the ride home and one folded dollar bill that a dead stranger had decided he was worth. And as he walked, he did the math. He was 18 now, which meant the system was done with him. No more group home. No more monthly check from the state. No more caseworker named Donna who forgot his birthday 2 years running, but always remembered to lecture him about his grades. He had a studio apartment above a laundromat in South Seattle. He had a part-time job stocking shelves at night. He had $400 saved in a coffee can. And he had Theo. The thought of the boy made his chest do something complicated. Worry and warmth all tangled up. Because Theo was the only thing in the world that was actually his. Not by blood, not by paperwork, by something stronger than either. Caleb pulled his collar up and kept walking through the rain. Somewhere above him, the Whitmore name glowed on the side of a building lit up gold against the gray. He didn't look up at it. The next morning, Seattle woke under the same blanket of gray. The apartment above the laundromat was small enough that Caleb could touch two walls if he stretched out his arms. The heater rattled like it was thinking about quitting. The paint peeled in the corners. It smelled always faintly of dryer sheets from the machines running downstairs. But it was warm, and it was his. He sat at the little kitchen table with a paper bag from the corner store. Inside the bag was one loaf of cheap white bread. That was breakfast. That was, if he was honest, most of breakfast for the foreseeable future until his next paycheck cleared. Across from him sat Theo, 10 years old, skinny in the way that worried Caleb, messy brown hair that no comb had ever won a fight against, and eyes too big and too watchful for a kid that age. The eyes of someone who had learned early to read a room, to know when the grown-ups were about to start yelling, to know when it was time to be invisible. Caleb knew those eyes. He'd had them once. Still did sometimes in the mirror. He tore the loaf of bread in half, slid the bigger piece across the table. "Eat," he said. "You've got school." Theo frowned at the bread, then at Caleb. "You should take the big half. You're the one who had the fancy meeting yesterday." Caleb almost smiled. "Trust me, it wasn't that fancy." "Did you get money?" "Eat your breakfast, Theo." "That's not a no." "Eat," Theo grumbled, but he ate. And Caleb watched him eat the way he always did, made sure the kid got enough. That was the rule, the one rule Caleb had made for himself the day he'd talked the system into letting Theo stay with him. Provisional guardianship, temporary on paper. A trial run, the caseworker had called it, like Theo was a car you took for a test drive. The kid had been getting bounced from home to home for 2 years. Nobody wanted a 10-year-old with a temper and a file full of red flags. Nobody except Caleb, who looked at him and saw himself at that age. Angry because the world had given him every reason to be. So Caleb had stepped up. 18 years old, broke with a part-time job in a studio apartment. He'd stood in front of a judge and a social worker and made his case. And somehow, on a provisional basis with monthly check-ins and a stack of conditions, they'd let him keep the boy. It wasn't permanent, not yet. The hearing for permanent guardianship was 2 months out. And Caleb knew exactly how it would go if he showed up looking unstable, looking poor, looking like a kid raising a kid in an apartment that smelled like a laundromat. He didn't let himself think about that too much. He just made sure Theo ate. Theo was halfway through his bread when headlights swept across the window. Caleb looked up. A black SUV had pulled to a slow stop on the street below. The kind of car that did not belong on this block. The kind of car that in this neighborhood usually meant trouble of one flavor or another. Caleb's stomach tightened. Then came the knock at the door. 3 knocks. Even. Patient. Caleb stood, put himself between the door and Theo without quite meaning to. Another old habit. "Stay there," he said quietly. He opened the door and froze. Standing in the hallway was a tall man in a charcoal suit. Older, maybe 60, hair gone silver gray, cut close. A face that gave nothing away. Calm eyes that had clearly seen a great deal and decided to keep most of it to themselves. Caleb recognized him. The lawyer, from the day before. The one who'd read the will. The one who'd slid him the envelope with the dollar in it. "Good morning, Mr. Mercer," the man said. His voice was even, courteous. He'd introduced himself yesterday somewhere in the blur of marble and humiliation, but Caleb hadn't caught it. "Desmond Hart," the man said now, as if he'd read the question on Caleb's face. "I was Arthur Whitmore's attorney. May I come in?" Caleb didn't move for a second, because nothing about this made sense. Because rich lawyers in expensive suits did not show up at apartments above laundromats. Because the will had been read, the dollar had been handed over. The joke was complete. There was no reason for this man to be standing in his hallway. Except here he was. "It's not much," Caleb said, finally stepping back. "But come in." Desmond Hart stepped inside. His eyes moved across the room. The peeling paint, the rattling heater, the half loaf of bread on the table. The skinny kid sitting very still in his chair watching the stranger with those 2 big eyes. Hart took it all in, and his expression didn't change. He didn't wince, didn't pity. He just looked the way a man looks when he is recording something he intends to remember. Then he turned back to Caleb. "I believe Desmond Hart said we need to talk about that dollar." Caleb crossed his arms. If you came all the way down here to explain the joke, he said, you can save it. I got the message loud and clear yesterday. Hart shook his head, slowly, once. It wasn't a joke, he said. Something in the way he said it made Caleb go quiet. Hart reached into his coat, pulled out a slim folder, set it down on the kitchen table right next to the bread, as if the two things belonged in the same world. Your grandfather, Hart said carefully, was a very strategic man. Caleb blinked. My what? Your grandfather. I don't have a grandfather. The words came out flat, automatic. He'd said versions of that sentence his whole life. I don't have parents, I don't have family, I don't have anybody. You learn to say it without flinching. I don't have anybody. That's kind of the whole thing about me. Arthur Whitmore, Desmond Hart said, was your grandfather. The rattling heater filled the silence. Theo had stopped chewing. He was watching Caleb's face now, not the stranger's. Caleb stared at the lawyer, waited for the punchline. It didn't come. That's not possible, he said. It is entirely possible, and it is true. Then, Caleb's voice caught. He hated that it caught. He forced it level. Then why? Why would he leave me $1 if I'm his? He couldn't even say the word. Why $1? Desmond Hart opened the folder, slid a single document across the table toward him. Because, Hart said, leaving you nothing at all would have been a mistake. A legal one. If your name had simply been absent from the will, your uncle could have argued you were forgotten. An accidental omission. In probate law, that opens a door. It can trigger a challenge. Years of it. He tapped the paper with one finger. $1, he said, is not an accident. $1 proves your grandfather knew exactly who you were. That he chose. The dollar isn't an insult, Mr. Mercer. It's a lock on a door. It keeps your uncle out. Caleb looked down at the document. He didn't understand half the words on it. Legal language. Dense as concrete. But he understood the shape of what Hart was saying, and it turned his stomach over. Wait, he said. My uncle. You mean the guy who laughed at the table? Vincent Whitmore, Hart said. Yes, your father's brother. My father. The words landed somewhere deep and old. Caleb had spent 18 years with a blank where a father should be. A file folder with almost nothing in it. A last name that it turned out hadn't even been the right one. My father, Caleb said slowly. You knew my father. I knew him, Desmond Hart said. And for just a moment, something moved behind those calm eyes. Something that might have been grief held very carefully in place. Your father was a good man, Mr. Mercer. I'd like to tell you about him. But not here. Not like this. Then why bring me there at all? The question came out sharper than he meant it. Yesterday, the will. If the dollar was just a legal trick, why drag me into that room to get laughed at? You could have mailed it. You could have. Because, Hart said quietly, that wasn't the only will. The room went still. Caleb felt it before he understood it. The way the air changes right before something breaks. What? He said. Desmond Hart reached into his briefcase. From it, he drew out a small object and set it on the table. A key. Not a house key. Heavier than that. Old metal, dark with age, the kind of key that opens something that was meant to stay closed. This morning, Hart said, if you're willing, we're going to take a drive. Somewhere your uncle doesn't know exists. He paused. Somewhere your grandfather wanted you to see. Caleb looked at the key on the table, then at the lawyer, then at Theo, who was staring at all of it with his mouth slightly open, his bread forgotten in his hand. Every instinct Caleb had was screaming at him to be careful. Because good things did not happen to kids like him. Because when something looked too good, it was usually a trap with the jaws still open. Because hope in his experience was just the setup for the next disappointment. He'd learned that lesson early. He'd learned it hard. But he looked at the key, and he thought about the blank space where his father should be, and he thought about a grandfather he'd never known choosing him with one folded dollar. I have to take Theo to school first, Caleb said. It was not a yes, but it wasn't a no. Desmond Hart almost smiled. Of course, he said. An hour later, Caleb sat in the back of the black SUV as it pulled away from the laundromat and left the city behind. He dropped Theo at the elementary school 6 blocks away, watched him walk through the gate, watched him turn around twice to look back at the strange black car like he was memorizing it, like he was afraid it might take Caleb somewhere he couldn't follow. "I'll pick you up at 3, Caleb had told him. Same as always. Promise. Promise. And he meant it. He always meant it. Promises were the one thing Caleb never broke because he knew exactly what a broken promise felt like from the inside. Now the city thinned out around the highway. The towers gave way to neighborhoods. The neighborhoods gave way to trees. The road climbed up into the forested foothills east of Seattle where the evergreens grew tall and close and blocked out what was left of the gray sky. Desmond Hart sat across from him quiet. He hadn't pushed, hadn't filled the silence with small talk. Caleb appreciated that more than he could have said. Finally, Caleb spoke. "Tell me about him," he said. "My father." Hart was quiet for a moment, watching the trees go by. "His name was Daniel," he said. "Daniel Whitmore. He was the younger of Arthur's 2 sons, and he was, in my opinion, the better of the 2 by a wide margin." "What was he like?" "Patient," Hart said. "Honest to a fault. He had a way of listening that made people feel heard. Arthur used to say Daniel was the only person in the company who could deliver bad news and somehow make you grateful for it." A faint, sad smile. He was being groomed to take over. Everyone knew it, including his brother. Caleb's hands had gone tight in his lap. "What happened to him?" Hart didn't answer right away. "That," he said at last, "is a conversation for a different room. There's a letter. Your grandfather wrote it for you in his own hand. He wanted you to hear it from him, not from me." He looked at Caleb. "We're almost there." The road narrowed, then narrowed again. It turned off the highway and became a long private drive, unmarked, easy to miss. The SUV slowed. Tall iron gates stood across the road, half hidden by snow-dusted pines. Hart leaned forward, and the driver entered a code, and the gates swung open without a sound. And there at the end of the drive it stood. A house. No, bigger than a house. A secluded mountain estate set against a wall of towering pines, the roof and the ground soft under a fresh layer of snow. Stone and dark timber. Tall windows reflecting the white world around them. It looked like something out of a dream Caleb had never let himself have. He just stared at it through the car window. "This was his," he said quietly. "This was his private retreat," Hart said. "Off the books. Held through a trust that has nothing to do with the rest of the estate. Vincent doesn't know it exists. No one does outside of 2 people. Myself. And as of this morning, you." The car stopped. They got out. The cold hit Caleb's lungs clean and sharp, nothing like the wet gray of the city. His scuffed sneakers crunched in the snow. He felt very strongly that he did not belong here. That at any second someone would come out and tell him there'd been a mistake, that he should leave the way he'd come. But no one came. Desmond Hart led him up the steps, unlocked the heavy front door, and brought him inside through quiet rooms full of books and dark wood, and the smell of cold stone and old fires down a staircase into a study buried in the lower floor of the house. It was a beautiful room, walls lined with shelves, a stone fireplace cold now dark with old ash, a heavy desk, and there in the center of the room, set into the floor on a raised stone base, stood a large steel safe. Hart crossed to it, took the old metal key from his coat. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "what you're about to see your grandfather kept hidden for a reason. Once you know it, you can't unknow it. Are you certain you want to?" Caleb looked at the safe. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. The dollar bill was still folded in his jacket pocket right over that pounding heart. He thought about every closed door that had ever been shut in his face. Every room he'd been told he wasn't allowed in. Every time the world had decided before he even spoke that he didn't get to have what other people had. And now here was a door, and a man holding out the key and telling him it was his choice. "Open it," Caleb said. Hart fit the key into the lock, turned it. A heavy click, the sound of something old giving way. The door of the safe swung open. Inside, neatly arranged, were stacks of sealed envelopes, bound documents, account statements. Caleb leaned closer and the numbers on the top page swam in front of his eyes, then resolve, then made him stop breathing. $50 million, held in trust, tied to accounts he didn't understand, in a language he didn't speak, but the number was clear enough. $50 million. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. He took an unsteady step back. That's not, he started. That can't be. It is, Hart said simply. But before Caleb could reach for any of it, before his shaking hand could even rise toward the stacks, Desmond Hart held out something else first. A single envelope, older than the rest, the name on the front written in a careful, old-fashioned hand. Caleb. Just his first name. Nothing else. As if the man who'd written it had known him. As if they'd been close. As if Caleb had been someone in this man's life all along and not a stranger who'd been laughed out of a conference room the day before. He asked me to give you this, Hart said quietly. Before anything else, before the money, before the rest of it. He was very clear about the order. Caleb took the envelope. His hands were not steady. He noticed that distantly the way you notice something happening to someone else. He broke the seal, unfolded the page inside, and as he began to read the words his grandfather had written for him in that careful old hand, Caleb understood something that turned the whole world sideways. The dollar had never been the inheritance. It had only been the beginning. He stood in the quiet underground study, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. The cold fireplace gaped beside him. The safe stood open behind him, full of more money than he had ever let himself imagine. And none of it mattered in that moment as much as the words on the page. He read the first line. Caleb, if you are reading this, then Desmond has done his job and I am gone, and we have run out of time to meet. I am sorry for that. The fault is mine and I will explain it, though I doubt any explanation will be enough. Caleb glanced up. Hart stood near the wall, hands folded behind his back, giving him space. Saying nothing. Caleb looked back down at the page and kept reading. Your father was the best of us. I do not say that to flatter the dead. I say it because it is true and because I spent too many years failing to say it while he was alive. Daniel had a kind of judgment that cannot be taught. The kind a man needs to be trusted with anything that matters. I meant for him to have everything. Your uncle knew that. And your uncle made certain it never happened. Caleb's chest tightened. Years ago, there was a development deal in Phoenix. It was Vincent's, though. By the time it was done, he had arranged the paperwork so that it was not. When it collapsed, and it was always going to collapse, the debt did not fall on Vincent. It fell on your father. Vincent buried him in it, quietly, cleverly. By the time I understood what had been done, the damage was finished. Your father lost everything. His standing, his name in this family. And not long after, in the dark place that ruin pushes a good man toward, I lost him too. Caleb read that line 3 times. I lost him too. He felt the old weight press against his ribs, the blank space where a father should have been. He'd grown up with whispers and a thin file and a feeling he could never name. And now in a dead man's handwriting, the shape of it was finally clear. His father hadn't abandoned him. His father had been destroyed. And then there was a paragraph Caleb wasn't ready for. I knew about you, the letter said. Caleb went very still. I have known about you since you were 3 years old. I know that will be hard to read. I know what it means. It means I knew where you were, and I left you there. In the homes, in the system, year after year. And I let you believe you had no one. Caleb's hand started to shake harder. He knew, Caleb said out loud. His voice came out strange. He knew about me. Hart said nothing, but he didn't look surprised. Caleb read on, and the next words were the ones that broke something open in him. I want you to understand why the letter said, even if you can never forgive it. Vincent destroyed his own brother for a building. I had no doubt none what he would do to a child who stood between him and an inheritance. If I had claimed you, if I had brought you into this house and given you my name, I would have painted a target on your back that I could not protect you from. Not from a hospital bed, not from the grave. So I made a choice. The hardest choice of my life. I kept you hidden. I kept you poor and unknown and safe. I had a man watch over you from a distance, quietly, always quietly. The home you grew up in received funding for years that it never knew the source of. The shoes on certain children's feet. The roof that did not leak. That was me, reaching toward you the only way I dared. I told myself it was protection. Perhaps it was only cowardice wearing protection's clothes. You will have to be the judge of that. You have every right to hate me. I would not blame you. Caleb's eyes were burning. He blinked hard. He would not cry in front of the lawyer. He would not. 18 years. 18 years of believing he was nobody's. 18 years of waiting rooms and donation lines and being the leftover. And the whole time, somewhere up in these mountains, an old man had been watching, choosing to stay away, telling himself it was love. Was it Caleb didn't know? He honestly didn't know. It felt like love and abandonment all tangled together so tightly he couldn't pull them apart. How could it be both? How could a man protect you by leaving you in the cold? Except Caleb knew something about that, didn't he? Because wasn't that exactly what he did for Theo every single day, went without so the kid could have? Made hard, quiet choices and never told the boy the cost. Loved someone by carrying the weight alone where they couldn't see it. The thought arrived sideways and knocked the breath out of him. Maybe he understood his grandfather better than he wanted to. He kept reading. The handwriting changed in the last part of the letter. Firmer, steadier. The hand of a man who had stopped apologizing and started giving instructions. Here is what I could not do, the letter said, and what I am asking you to do in my place. For the last years of my life, I watched Vincent hollow out the company I built with my own hands. I could not remove him without tearing the whole thing down and putting thousands of livelihoods at risk. He made certain of that too. He is good at making himself impossible to remove. But he made one mistake. He never accounted for you. You are outside his reach. He does not even know your face. The 50 million in this safe is yours, but it is not a gift. It is a tool. I am asking you to use it, to take back what he stole, to take control of Whitmore Holdings, and to do for the company and for the people in it what your father would have done if he had been allowed to live. Caleb turned the page. His hands had stopped shaking. They'd gone steady the way they did when there was a job in front of him that needed doing. The final instructions were short and terrifying. You have 30 days from the reading of the will. 30 days to gain controlling leverage over Whitmore Holdings. Buy debt, buy influence. Do whatever is lawful and whatever is necessary. Desmond will guide you. He is the only man left in this world I trust completely. If you succeed, everything I built is yours to set right. If you fail, if the 30 days pass and Vincent still holds the company, the trust dissolves. The money is gone, and he wins. For good. I am sorry to put this on you. You did not ask for any of it, but you are the only one left who can. And something tells me, though, we never met, that you are more your father's son than you know. Make it right, Caleb. There was no signature, just a single line at the bottom in that same careful hand. I should have come for you. I am sorry I waited until it was too late. Caleb lowered the letter slowly. The room was very quiet. The fire was cold. Outside the high windows, snow drifted down through the pines, soundless, endless white. 30 days. He stood there holding the letter from a grandfather he would never meet, with $50 million at his back and a folded dollar bill over his heart, and he tried to understand what was being asked of him. 30 days, Caleb said finally. His voice was rough. I'm 18. I stock shelves at night. I can barely read half the words on these papers. He gestured at the open safe. And he wants me to take down a company, a real company, from a man who's run it for years. Desmond Hart stepped forward at last, out of the shadow by the wall into the gray light from the windows. Yes, Hart said. That's insane. It is a great deal to ask, Hart agreed. Possibly too much. Your grandfather knew that. He wrestled with it for a long time before he wrote those words. He paused. But he also knew something else. And so do I. What? Hart's calm eyes met his. Vincent Whitmore, Hart said, has spent his entire life facing people who had something to lose. Rivals with reputations, partners with families, board members with pensions. He knows exactly how to find the thing a man is afraid to lose and squeeze it until the man does what he wants. A small pause. He has never once in all those years faced someone with nothing left to lose. Caleb said nothing. He doesn't know your name, Hart went on quietly. He doesn't know your face. He laughed at you across the table yesterday and has already forgotten you exist. He thinks the only thing that came between him and the whole fortune was a single dollar and a joke. Hart let that sit. He has no idea what your grandfather just handed you, and he has no idea who you are. Caleb looked down at the letter in one hand. Then he reached into his jacket with the other and took out the folded dollar bill. Unfolded it, looked at it, old and creased and ordinary. A lock on a door, Hart had called it. But it was more than that now. It was the first thing his grandfather had ever given him. Proof in soft, worn paper that an old man up in the mountains had known he existed and had reached toward him the only way he dared, too late, too quietly, but real. Caleb thought about his father buried in someone else's debt. He thought about the 18 years of cold. He thought about a man named Vincent Whitmore laughing across a table who had hollowed out everything good in this family and never once paid for it. And he thought about Theo. Skinny Theo with the two big watchful eyes who got bounced from home to home because nobody wanted a kid with a temper and a file full of red flags. Theo who had 2 months until a judge decided whether Caleb got to keep him. Theo who deserved a world where the people who hurt children didn't always win. Something settled in Caleb's chest. Not anger, past anger now. Something colder and clearer and steadier than he had ever felt in his life. He folded the dollar bill back up, slipped it into the pocket over his heart. "Okay," he said. Hart raised an eyebrow. "Okay. Teach me." Caleb looked at the open safe, at the stacks of paper he couldn't yet read, at the impossible thing his grandfather had asked of him. "Whatever this is, however it works, teach me. We've got 30 days. For the first time since Caleb had met him, Desmond Hart smiled. A real one. Small but real. Something almost like pride moved behind the calm. "Your father," Hart said quietly, "would have said exactly the same thing, in exactly that voice." Outside, the snow kept falling, and somewhere down in the city, 42 floors above the streets, Vincent Whitmore was sitting in an office that wasn't really his, running a company he had stolen with absolutely no idea that the boy he had laughed at the day before had just decided to take it all back. The clock had started. 29 days to go. The lessons began the next morning, and they did not stop. Desmond Hart moved Caleb up to the mountain estate for the duration. It made sense, he explained. The work needed privacy, the work needed quiet, and the work needed to happen somewhere Vincent Whitmore would never think to look. So Caleb packed his worn-out backpack again. 2 t-shirts, a pair of jeans, and 1 folded dollar bill over his heart. But this time he wasn't going alone, because there was Theo. Caleb had thought about it for all of 1 second. The boy was not staying behind in a studio apartment above a laundromat while Caleb disappeared into the mountains for a month. Not happening. So Theo came too. New school enrolled within the week, a small one down in the foothills town, and a long, quiet ride there and back each morning that Caleb made himself every single day no matter what. Because he'd promised. And Caleb did not break promises. The estate had more bedrooms than Caleb could count. Theo picked the one with the window that looked out at the pines. First night, the kid stood at that window for a long time just staring at the snow like he didn't trust it to still be there in the morning. Caleb knew that feeling. He stood in the doorway and watched the boy watch the snow, and he didn't say anything, because some things you just let a kid have. Then the work swallowed him whole. Every morning before the drive to Theo's school and after the drive back, Hart sat him down in the underground study and taught him a world. It was a world Caleb had never been allowed near. A world that ran underneath the one everyone else lived in. Companies that borrowed money to grow. Banks that lent it. Investors who bought and sold the borrowing itself like trading cards, like chips at a table the size of a country. "Most people think a company is owned by the people who hold its stock," Hart said one evening, tapping a spreadsheet with a pen. "That's what they want you to think. It's simpler that way." "It's not true. It's not the whole truth." Hart leaned back. "A company is owned by whoever it owes. Stock is loud. Stock shows up in the newspaper. You buy a big block of stock, alarms ring, everyone turns to look." He set the pen down. "Debt is quiet. Debt hides in the dark. And when a company is leaning on enough debt, the people who hold that debt can pull the floor out from under everyone above them." He looked at Caleb. "Buying stock gets attention, Caleb. Buying debt gets control." Caleb wrote that down. He wrote down everything, because here's the thing nobody had ever known about Caleb Mercer. He was smart, not school smart. School had been a place he survived, not a place he shined. Too many moves, too many new classrooms, too many nights worrying about the wrong things to ever care about a worksheet. The system had stamped him average and moved on, but the system had never put anything in front of him that mattered. This mattered. So Caleb learned, fast, faster than Hart expected, and Hart did not expect much from anyone. The boy soaked it up like dry ground in the first rain, asked questions that made the old lawyer stop and think, saw patterns 3 steps ahead. By the end of the first week, Hart caught himself explaining something only once, where he'd planned to explain it 3 times. Your father, Hart said quietly the night that happened, learned the same way. Once was enough for him, too. Caleb didn't look up from the page, but something in him warmed and ached all at once. By the end of the first week, they were ready to make a move. A small one. A test. There was a tranche of distressed debt tied to Whitmore Holdings, a bundle of loans the company had taken on years ago for a project that never delivered. The loans were worth less than their face value now, which meant they could be bought cheap, which meant whoever bought them would suddenly hold a piece of paper that said Whitmore Holdings owes me. We start here, Hart said. Small, careful. We learn how it feels before we risk anything that matters. Caleb nodded. His heart was pounding. He'd never had more than $400 in his life, and now he was about to move real money. Serious money. His grandfather's money. He should have felt powerful. He felt sick, because what if he got it wrong? They needed help to do it right. Hart knew people, but Hart was known, and being known was dangerous now. They needed a face that wasn't connected to either of them. A financial consultant who could move quietly, place the buys, keep Caleb's name off everything. Hart made some calls, discreet ones, and a name came back recommended through a contact Hart trusted. Adrian Voss, sharp, confident, younger than Caleb expected, maybe mid-30s, with the easy polish of a man who'd learned which fork to use a long time ago. He drove up to the estate in a car that cost too much and shook Caleb's hand with a grip that was exactly firm enough. So you're the mystery client, Voss said, smiling. Don't worry, mystery's my specialty. Caleb didn't smile back. He didn't trust easy charm. He'd grown up around too many adults who smiled right up until the moment they didn't. But Voss was good. That much was obvious from the first hour. He knew the market's cold. He knew which sellers were quietly desperate and which were just pretending. He guided Caleb through the first purchase of distressed debt with a steady, practiced hand, and when it was done, when Caleb sat there holding a piece of paper that said, a sliver of Whitmore Holdings now answered to him, Voss leaned back and grinned. Welcome to the table, kid, he said. And for one dangerous second, Caleb let himself feel it. The feeling lasted exactly until the second deal. The second deal was bigger. Voss was the one who pushed for it. A larger bundle of bonds he said available at a price that wouldn't last. They had to move quickly. They had to move now. Caleb hesitated. Something about the speed of it. Something about the way Voss kept glancing at his watch. But the numbers looked right. And the clock was ticking. 22 days left. Now the math always running somewhere in the back of Caleb's skull. So he leaned toward yes. He leaned toward yes. And Desmond Hart, who had been quietly reviewing the paperwork in the corner the whole time, stood up. No, Hart said. The room went still. Voss turned the easy smile still on his face. I'm sorry. This deal. Hart held up the document. His calm voice had gone very flat. These bonds, where did they come from? Distressed seller, motivated. I told you it won't last. Who, Hart said, is the seller? A pause, just a beat too long. A holding company, Voss said smoothly. Nothing unusual. Shell structure, sure, but everyone uses. Hart set the document down on the desk, tapped one line of it. This shell, he said quietly, traces back to an entity I recognize. An entity that was set up 4 years ago by Vincent Whitmore. The room stopped breathing. Caleb looked at the paper, then at Voss, then back at the paper. These aren't distressed bonds for sale, Hart said, still in that flat, terrible calm. These are bonds Vincent moved into a shell himself. He's not losing them. He's planning them. If Caleb buys these, he's not gaining leverage. Hart looked up. He's handing Vincent a tracing line straight back to the mystery buyer. He's exposing himself with his own money. Caleb's stomach dropped through the floor. He turned to Voss, slowly. You were going to walk me into that, Caleb said. His voice came out quiet. Too quiet. Voss's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes did. I don't know what he's talking about, Voss said. Shell companies cross-connect all the time. It's the nature of my... Stop. Caleb stood up. Just stop. And here is the part that Caleb would think about later in the dark. He didn't yell. The old Caleb would have yelled. The foster home Caleb, the kid with the temper, the boy who'd learned that the only way to be heard was to be loud. That Caleb would have flipped the table. But this Caleb just stood there, cold and clear, looking at the man who had smiled at him and called him kid and tried to feed him to the wolf. You're working for him, Caleb said. For Vincent. Voss said nothing, which was its own answer. How long? Caleb asked. Kid, how long? The smile finally fell off Adrian Voss's face, and what was left underneath was just tired. A man who'd been caught and knew it and had been caught before. The contact who recommended me, Voss said quietly. He works for Vincent too. You were never going to hire a stranger off the street. Vincent made sure the only road to a consultant led through one of his people. A small bitter shrug. You walked into the only door that was open. He left it open on purpose. Caleb felt the ground shift under everything. The first deal, the easy success, the welcome to the table kid, all of it. Bait. Get out, Caleb said. Voss got out. The door closed behind him. The car, too expensive for the road, crunched away down the snow. And Caleb stood in the study, shaking while Desmond Hart watched him with those calm old eyes. I almost did it, Caleb said. His voice cracked. I almost said yes. If you hadn't... He stopped, pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. I almost lost everything in week 1 because somebody smiled at me. Yes, Hart said. He didn't soften it. You did. That's supposed to make me feel better. No, Hart crossed to him. It's supposed to teach you something. So listen. He waited until Caleb dropped his hands. In this world, Caleb loyalty is often rented, not bought. Rented. A man can be on your side completely right up until someone pays for a different side. His voice gentled just slightly. You'll meet 100 Adrian Voss in your life if you keep walking this road. The trick isn't never trusting anyone. The trick is knowing that everyone has a price written somewhere and learning to read it before they spend you. Caleb wiped his face, nodded. It was a hard lesson. It would not be the last one. Because the next morning, Vincent Whitmore stopped playing quiet. It started small. A transaction Caleb tried to make was declined. Then another. A bank that had processed his last buy without blinking suddenly wouldn't send back a polite note about a review of the account. Then another bank, then a third. He's noticed, Hart said grimly, reading the notices. Not who you are, but that someone is moving on his debt. He's felt the pressure, and he's swinging at the dark. By midday, it was worse. A legal complaint had been filed, public splashy accusing an unnamed investor of attempting to manipulate the debt structure of Whitmore Holdings. No name yet. Vincent didn't have the name. But he had lawyers, and lawyers were like bloodhounds, and the longer this went, the closer they'd get. The doors were closing, one by one. The exact thing Caleb had spent his whole life feeling, except now it was happening with money, and the stakes were a company and a father's memory and a grandfather's last wish. 20 days left. Then 19. Caleb sat up late in the study, the letter spread on the desk in front of him, reading his grandfather's words again like they might tell him something new. Desmond Hart came in near midnight, poured 2 glasses from a bottle on the shelf, set one down beside Caleb. Whiskey. Caleb looked at it but didn't touch it. He was 18. Hart knew that. The glass was a gesture, not an offer. A way of saying, I'm sitting with you in this. It's slipping, Caleb said. Every door he closes, I've got fewer ways through. And the clock? He shook his head. 19 days. Maybe it's not possible. Maybe he set it up so it was never possible. Hart was quiet a moment. Your grandfather didn't choose you because this would be easy, he said. Caleb looked up, and Hart met his eyes, steady, certain. He chose you because of what you don't have, the old lawyer said. Every door Vincent's closing, he's closing it the way you close a door on arrival. Someone with a reputation to protect, assets to freeze, a name to ruin. A pause. You don't have any of that. You're a ghost. You came out of a foster home 4 days ago with a backpack and $1. There is nothing for him to freeze, nothing for him to ruin. He's swinging at someone who isn't there. Caleb stared at him. Stop fighting him in the daylight, Hart said. That's his country. The banks, the courts, the public complaints, that's where he's king. He leaned forward. Go where he can't follow. Go quiet. Go small. Buy the debt through a dozen tiny vehicles, none of them connected, none of them loud. Let him swing at shadows in the light. While in the dark, piece by piece, you take the floor out from under him. Something opened in Caleb's chest. Something like hope. He didn't quite trust it, but he held on to it. Quiet, he said. Quiet, Hart agreed. So they went quiet. For the next 2 weeks, Caleb Mercer disappeared into the dark and went to work. No more big moves, no more single deals that lit up the board. Instead, dozens of small ones scattered across a web of private vehicles. Hart helped him build each one, too small to notice each one buying up another sliver of Whitmore Holdings debt. A loan here, a bond there. Patient, invisible, like water finding every crack in a wall. Vincent kept fighting the ghost in the daylight. Froze accounts that didn't matter. Chased a complaint against an investor who didn't exist. Spent his lawyer's hours and his own attention swinging at a shadow. And underneath him in the dark, the floor kept disappearing. Caleb barely slept. He'd work the deals at night, drive Theo to school in the gray morning, come back and work again. He lost weight. His eyes went hollow. Hart told him more than once to rest. He didn't. Because there was a clock, and there was a father in the ground who'd never gotten the chance, and there was a boy down the hall who deserved a world where the right people won. Theo, for his part, watched all of it with those two big eyes. The kid was smart, smarter than the system had ever credited. He didn't understand the details, but he understood the shape of it, that Caleb was fighting something big and tiring himself out and carrying it mostly alone. So Theo did what he could, made toast in the mornings badly, and slid the bigger piece across the table to Caleb, because he'd seen Caleb do it for him 100 times, and figured that was just what you did for someone you... He never finished that sentence even to himself. But he made the toast. One night, Caleb found the kid asleep in the study chair, waiting up for him, a blanket pulled up to his chin. And Caleb stood there in the doorway looking at him and felt the whole weight of why he was doing this settle right into the center of his chest. He carried Theo up to bed, tucked the blanket around him, stood at the window the kid loved and looked out at the snow and made himself a quiet promise in the dark. He was going to win this, not for the money, for the boy who made bad toast and waited up, so that the boy would never ever have to know what the cold felt like again. Then with 11 days left, Vincent Whitmore found Theo. Caleb would never know exactly how. A school record maybe, a trail back through the provisional guardianship paperwork. Vincent had lawyers, and lawyers were bloodhounds, and somewhere in the chase for the ghost, they'd stumbled on to the one thing that wasn't a shadow, the boy. But Vincent didn't do what Caleb braced for. There was no threat, no black car outside the school, no man in a suit grabbing Theo by the arm. Caleb had spent his whole life ready for that kind of danger, the loud kind, the kind you can see coming and put your body in front of. This was worse, because what arrived on a quiet Tuesday delivered by courier to the estate was a folder, and inside the folder was a petition. Vincent Whitmore and his wife Eleanor Whitmore had filed for guardianship of a 10-year-old minor named Theo. Caleb read it 3 times. The words wouldn't go in. I don't... He looked up at Hart, the page shaking in his hand. I don't understand. He wants Theo. Why would he... He doesn't even know Theo. He doesn't... And then he understood, all at once, the way a man understands the trap only after the jaws have shut. It's a weapon, Caleb said. His voice had gone hollow. He found the one thing I'd actually fight for. And he's not threatening it. He laughed a horrible, breathless sound. He's offering it a better home. Hart took the folder, read it himself, jaw tightening. It's elegant, Hart said quietly, almost to himself. I'll give the devil that. He can't find the ghost moving on his debt, but he found the boy the ghost loves, And he doesn't have to do anything illegal. He just has to be better. Caleb looked at him. A wealthy married couple, Hart went on. A stable home, mansions, the best schools, versus, he gestured at the page, versus an 18-year-old with a provisional arrangement and a permanent hearing in weeks who's currently living in a borrowed house and hasn't slept in 3 weeks, in front of a family court judge. Hart's voice was grim. Vincent looks like a gift. Caleb, he looks like the answer to a prayer. And you, I look like a kid who can't take care of him. The words came out flat. Dead. Caleb sat down, slowly, like his legs had stopped working. Because here was the trap, and it was perfect. He could keep fighting for the company, pour every hour and every ounce of himself into the dark work of buying debt and taking back what Vincent stole. Win his father's memory back. Win his grandfather's last wish. Or he could fight for the boy. But he couldn't do both. Not in 11 days. There wasn't enough of him. There wasn't enough time. Every hour he spent in family court building his case to keep Theo was an hour he wasn't spending on the company. And every hour on the company was an hour Vincent's lawyer spent making Caleb look to a judge like exactly what the system had always said he was. Unstable, unfit, a leftover trying to raise a leftover. Choose, the trap said. The company or the boy. You can't have both. And the worst part, the part that made Caleb's hands shake on the desk. He knew which one his grandfather would tell him to choose. The letter was right there. Make it right, Caleb. 30 days, the company, the father's memory, the thousands of livelihoods, the whole point of everything. But it wasn't a contest, not really, not for 1 second. Because Caleb looked down the hall toward the room where a skinny kid with messy brown hair was asleep behind a window full of snow, and he knew. There was no version of this where he handed Theo to the man who'd destroyed his own brother. None. He'd burn the company down first. He thinks I'll choose the money, Caleb said quietly. He looked up at Hart and something had gone very still and very clear in his eyes. Vincent, he thinks I'm him. He thinks anyone faced with $50 million and a whole company on one side and a foster kid on the other, he thinks they pick the money. Hart said nothing. He doesn't understand, Caleb said. He's never understood. That's his whole problem, isn't it? He thinks everyone has a price. A breath. He thinks Theo is a price. And in that moment, something hardened in Caleb that would never soften again. Not anger. Anger was too small for it. This was bedrock. He would not become Vincent. He would not trade a child for a company. Whatever happened in the next 11 days, even if he lost everything, even if the trust dissolved and the money vanished and Vincent won the whole empire, Caleb was keeping the boy. That was the floor. That was the thing underneath everything else that did not move. But God, he was so tired, and the trap was so good, and 11 days was so few. He didn't see a way through. He honestly didn't. For the first time since he'd opened that safe, Caleb Mercer looked at the thing in front of him and could not find the door. That was the night the phone rang. Late, after midnight, a number Caleb didn't know. He almost didn't answer. But something made him pick up. Mercer. The voice on the other end was quiet, strained. It took Caleb a second to place it. Adrian Voss. Caleb sat up. You've got a lot of nerve. Just listen, please. And something in the please stopped him, because Adrian Voss did not say please. Voss was charm and confidence and easy smiles. This voice was none of those things. This voice sounded like a man who hadn't slept either. I know what he's doing with the kid. I know about the petition. Caleb's grip tightened on the phone. How do you? Because I still hear things. From his side. A pause, a breath that shook. I need to tell you something, and then I need to give you something, and after that you'll never hear from me again. Caleb said nothing. Waited. When I took his money, Voss said, I told myself it was just business. That's what we all say. Just business. Loyalty's rented right. I think I even said that to you. A bitter sound. I've done a lot of just business in my life, Mercer. Walked a lot of people into a lot of bad rooms. Never lost sleep over one of them. Then why are you calling me at midnight? A long silence. Because I have a daughter, Voss said. The words landed strange in the dark. She's grown now, but I wasn't, his voice caught. I wasn't there when she was small. Long story, bad story. She spent some years in the system Mercer, group homes, the whole thing, while I was off doing just business. A breath. When I heard what Vincent was doing, going after your kid, using a foster kid as a chip in a poker game, the bitter sound again rawer this time. Something in me just stopped. I couldn't. I've done a lot of things. I can't do that one. Caleb was very still. He keeps everything, Voss said. Vincent, every dirty thing he writes it down because he thinks the writing protects him. Accounts, transfers, the shell companies, the money he's been pulling out of Whitmore Holdings for years and hiding offshore where the board can't see it. A pause. I had access to some of it while I worked for him. I kept copies. Insurance, I told myself. Everybody keeps insurance. Caleb's heart was pounding so hard he could barely hear. What are you saying? He whispered. I'm saying Adrian Voss said that I'm about to send you everything. The accounts, the transfers, the offshore structure. Proof that Vincent Whitmore has been stealing from his own company for years. A breath. It won't help you buy the debt any faster. That part you still have to do yourself. But Mercer, when the moment comes, when you finally stand in front of that man and those board members and everyone who ever laughed at you. His voice steadied. This is what ends him. Not the leverage. This. The truth. Caleb closed his eyes, the man who tried to feed him to the wolf, calling at midnight to hand him the knife instead. Because somewhere out there was a grown daughter who'd spent years in the cold, and a father who'd finally too late decided he couldn't help build one more cold place for one more child. Loyalty is often rented, Hart had said. But this wasn't rented. Nobody was paying Adrian Voss for this. This was something else. This was the thing that lived underneath the price in the part of a person the money never quite reached. Why, Caleb said. Why give it to me? You could sell it. You could... Because you didn't yell at me, Voss said quietly. Caleb opened his eyes. That day, in the study, when you caught me. Voss's voice was soft now, almost wondering. I've been caught before, Mercer. People scream, they threaten, they tell you what kind of garbage you are, and you know what they're usually right. A pause. You just looked at me, and you said, get out, quiet, like you were disappointed, like you'd expected better of me. A long breath. Nobody's expected better of me in a long time. I keep thinking about that. So consider it my resignation. From the just business life. Watch your phone. The line went dead. Caleb sat in the dark study, the phone still pressed to his ear, listening to nothing. And then his phone buzzed. Once. A file arriving. He opened it with shaking hands, scrolled and scrolled. Account numbers, wire transfers, dates, amounts. Shell companies linked like beads on a string, all of them tracing back in the end to one name. Vincent Whitmore. Years of it, millions of it. Money pulled quietly out of the company. His grandfather had built money that should have gone to the workers and the projects and the people. Whitmore Holdings was supposed to serve, siphoned off into the dark and hidden across the ocean. Caleb sat there and stared at it. He didn't have a way through the trap yet. 11 days. The clock still running. The boys still on the table. The doors still closing one by one. But for the first time in days, Caleb Mercer wasn't looking at a wall. He was looking at a weapon. He set the phone down, carefully, pressed his hand flat against his jacket pocket where one folded dollar bill still sat. The first thing his grandfather had ever given him. Proof that an old man in the mountains had known he existed. And now in the dark, Caleb finally let himself feel the thing he'd been too afraid to feel. Not hope exactly. Something harder than hope. Resolve. 11 days. Down in the city, in an office that wasn't really his. Vincent Whitmore slept soundly, certain he'd already won. Certain the boy would take the bait. Certain everyone in the end had a price. He had no idea the ghost had a name now. He had no idea the name had a face, and the face had a backpack, and a dead father, and a borrowed mountain house full of his own brother's secrets. He had no idea that a man he'd bought and discarded had just handed that face the one thing that could burn it all down. And he had no idea none what was coming for him. Down the hall behind a window full of falling snow, Theo slept. And Caleb sat up the rest of the night, reading, planning, building the thing in the dark piece by piece the way Hart had taught him. Because the clock was running, and he had a company to take back, a boy to keep, a father to answer for, and $1 to return to the man who'd thought it was an insult. The next 9 days were the longest of Caleb's life. He fought on two fronts, and he barely slept on either one. By day there was the company, the quiet work in the dark, the patient buying vehicle by vehicle, loan by loan. Hart at his shoulder, the clock on the wall, the web tightening slow and silent around a man who still thought he was swinging at a ghost. But by night there was the other war, the one that mattered more, because there was the boy. The family court hearing for Vincent's guardianship petition was set. And it was set in the cruelest possible joke the universe could have arranged for 2 days before the 30-day deadline, which meant the worst of both wars would land at almost the same hour. Caleb hired a family lawyer, a real one paid for quietly out of the trust, because the trust was for setting things right, and there was nothing in the world Caleb needed to set right more than this. She was kind, she was sharp, and she did not lie to him. "I won't pretend this is easy," she told him the first night papers spread across the study desk. "You're 18. You've had Theo for less than a year on a provisional basis. And on the other side," she tapped Vincent's petition, "a married couple in their 60s, established, wealthy, spotless on paper." She looked at him. Judges are human. They see stability. They see a child's future. And on paper, Caleb, they're going to look stable, and you're going to look like a long shot. "On paper?" Caleb said. "On paper," she agreed, which is most of what a judge sees. Caleb nodded slowly, because here was the thing that kept him up at night, the thing that sat in his chest like a stone. What if they were right, not Vincent? Vincent was a snake and Caleb knew it. But the question underneath, the terrible question, what if a kid like Theo really would be better off in a mansion with the best schools, with people who could give him everything Caleb couldn't? Caleb couldn't promise Theo a big house, couldn't promise good schools or new clothes or a future without worry. All Caleb had ever been able to promise the boy was that he'd show up, that he'd never leave, that whatever happened, Theo would not be alone in the cold. Was that enough? Some nights in the dark, Caleb wasn't sure. He almost talked himself out of it once. 3 in the morning, 4 days out, staring at the ceiling. The thought crept in quiet and reasonable the way the worst thoughts do. Maybe you're being selfish. Maybe keeping him is about what you need, not what he needs. Maybe the loving thing, the brave thing is to let him go somewhere he'd have more. He sat with that thought for a long time. And then he got up, and he walked down the hall, and he stood in the doorway of the room with the window full of snow, and he looked at the boy sleeping there. And he thought about the letter, his grandfather's letter. I told myself it was protection. Perhaps it was only cowardice wearing protection's clothes. His grandfather had let him go, for good reasons, the best reasons, to keep him safe. And Caleb had spent 18 years in the cold believing he belonged to no one because a man who loved him had decided that giving him up was the loving thing. No, Caleb would not make that mistake. He would not let Theo grow up the way he had told in 100 quiet ways that he was a problem to be placed instead of a person to be kept. Theo didn't need a bigger house. Theo needed to know all the way down to the bone that someone had chosen him and would never unchoose him. That was the thing money couldn't buy, and it was the only thing Caleb had ever had to give. He went back to bed. He didn't talk himself out of it again. The hearing came on a cold gray morning. The family court was nothing like the glass tower. No marble, no floor-to-ceiling views. Just a tired municipal building, fluorescent lights, scuffed linoleum, the same color as nothing. People waiting on hard benches with their whole lives in manila folders. Caleb wore the one good suit Hart had bought him. He sat very straight. His hands did not shake. He'd made sure of that. Across the aisle sat Vincent Whitmore, and beside him Eleanor. Vincent's wife was elegant in the way of women who have never once worried about money, silver, and composed a string of pearls at her throat. She looked, Caleb thought, like a woman playing a role she'd been handed and was determined to play well. Vincent caught Caleb's eye across the aisle, And he smiled. The same smile. The one from the conference room. The one that said, "This is already over and we both know it." But Caleb noticed something Vincent didn't. He noticed that Eleanor did not smile. He noticed that Eleanor's hands were folded too tightly in her lap. He noticed that she did not look at the boy. Could not look at the boy. Caleb filed that away. Theo sat beside Caleb's lawyer, small in a chair too big for him, in the nice clothes Caleb had bought him. His messy hair finely combed flat for once. The boy's eyes were huge, darting, reading the room the way he always read rooms, looking for the exit, looking for the danger. And Caleb wanted more than he had ever wanted anything to lean over and tell him, "It's okay, I've got you. I'm not going anywhere." But he couldn't. Not yet. So he just caught the boy's eye and gave him the smallest nod. The one that meant, "I'm here." Theo nodded back. The hearing began. Vincent's lawyer went first, and he was good, smooth. He painted a picture, and it was a beautiful picture. A loving, established couple, a magnificent home, private schools, travel, opportunity, security, everything a child could dream of. He laid it out like a feast, and the judge, an older woman with tired, careful eyes, listened and took notes, and her face gave nothing away. Then he turned to Caleb, and he did not have to be cruel. That was the worst of it. He didn't raise his voice. He just laid out the facts gently, regretfully, as if it pained him. 18 years old, aged out of the system mere weeks ago. No steady career. A provisional guardianship arrangement less than a year old. No permanent home of his own, currently residing, the lawyer noted with delicate emphasis, in a property he did not own. A young man clearly of good heart. But the lawyer suggested softly, was good heart enough? Was love enough when set against everything the Whitmores could provide? "We don't doubt Mr. Mercer cares for the boy," the lawyer said. "We simply ask the court to consider what is best for the child's future. Not the adult's feelings, the child's future." And he sat down, and it landed exactly the way it was meant to. Caleb felt the room tilt toward Vincent, felt the judge's careful eyes weighing scuffed sneakers against private schools, felt in his gut the old terrible verdict rising up again. Not good enough, never good enough. A leftover trying to keep a leftover. His lawyer stood. She made her case, and she made it well. Stability isn't only money, she argued. Consistency. Devotion. A child who has been moved 7 times in 2 years and has finally stopped flinching. She was good. But Caleb could see it wasn't enough. He could see it in the judge's careful face. On paper, the lawyer had warned him, most of what a judge sees is paper. And then the judge did something unusual. She set down her pen. She looked for a long moment at the small boy in the too big chair. "I'd like to hear from the child," she said, "if he's willing. Theo, would you come up here and talk to me for a minute?" The room went still. Caleb's heart stopped. Because this was not in any plan. Because nobody could script a 10-year-old. Because Theo had spent 2 years learning to be invisible. Learning to give grown-ups the answers they wanted. Learning that the truth got you moved to the next house. What would the boy say? What had 2 years of fear taught him to say? Theo slid out of the chair, walked up to the judge's bench, small and stiff. The judge came down off her high seat, knelt to his level, the way good people do with frightened children. "Hi, Theo," she said gently. "You're not in any trouble. I just want to ask you something, okay? And there's no wrong answer. You just tell me the truth." Theo nodded, once. His eyes found Caleb across the room, held there. "These nice people," the judge said, glancing toward Vincent and Eleanor. "They have a big house, lots of nice things. And Caleb," she gestured, "well, Caleb's still pretty young himself, isn't he? Doesn't have as much." She paused. "If you could pick Theo, where would you want to live?" And here is the moment. Here is the moment the whole story had been driving toward, though none of them knew it. A frightened 10-year-old in borrowed nice clothes, standing in a tired courtroom, asked the one question that would decide everything. Theo was quiet for a long moment. And then he didn't talk about houses. He didn't talk about money or schools or any of the things the grown-ups had been arguing about all morning. He looked at the judge, and in a small, clear voice he said, "Caleb gives me the big half." The judge blinked. "I'm sorry, the big half of the bread," Theo said, like it was obvious. like it explained everything. Because to him it did. When there's not enough, he always gives me the big half, and he says he already ate, but I know he didn't. The boy's voice wobbled just slightly, but he kept going. Nobody ever did that before. Everybody before, they kept the big half. That's just what grown-ups do. He looked at Caleb and his huge eyes were wet now. But Caleb gives it to me, even when he's hungry. So I want to live where Caleb is. I don't care about the house. I just want to live where somebody gives me the big half. The courtroom was absolutely silent, and Caleb Mercer, who had not cried at the reading of the will, who had not cried when he learned his father had been destroyed, who had not cried reading a dead grandfather's apology, felt something break open in his chest right there on the scuffed linoleum, and he had to press his hand hard against his mouth to keep the sound in. Because the boy had been watching, all along, the bread, the small thing, the thing Caleb did every morning and never thought twice about, and never imagined anyone noticed. Theo had noticed. Theo had noticed everything. The judge knelt there a moment longer, and when she stood, Caleb saw that her careful, tired eyes were not so careful anymore. Something had moved in them, the thing that moves in any decent person when a child says something truer than all the lawyers in the room combined. But before the judge could speak, Your Honor, a voice, quiet, unsteady. Everyone turned. Eleanor Whitmore was on her feet. Vincent's head snapped toward her. Eleanor! Low, a warning. Sit down. She didn't sit down. Your Honor, Eleanor said again, and her composed voice was cracking now, the pearls trembling at her throat. I need to say something. I should have said it before we ever walked in here. She pressed a hand to her mouth, steadied herself. I can't do this. Eleanor. Vincent's voice was ice. We never discussed the child. She rounded on him and years of something came out all at once. You told me it was about the company. You told me it was leverage. A bargaining chip. You said we'd file the petition and the boy's guardian would back off your debt to make it go away, and then we'd quietly withdraw and no one would ever. Her voice broke completely. You never told me I'd have to sit in a room and look at him, Vincent. You never told me he gives the boy the big half of the bread. The silence in the courtroom had a weight to it. Vincent had gone very pale. We were never going to keep him, Eleanor said to the judge, the words tumbling now unstoppable. That's the truth. God forgive me. This was never about loving that child. It was about, she gestured helplessly at Vincent, about money, about forcing his guardian to give up some financial fight by dangling the one thing he'd never risk. We were going to use a little boy as a. She couldn't finish. She didn't have to. She turned to Caleb, and her elegant face was wrecked and old and human. I'm so sorry, she said to him. I'm so sorry. I don't know what's wrong with this family that we learn to treat people like pieces on a board. But I won't be part of it. Not with a child. Not anymore. And she sat down, and she wept. Vincent Whitmore sat beside his weeping wife in a tired municipal courtroom, and for the first time he looked like a man who had lost control of the board. The judge took a long breath. I think, she said, I have heard everything I need to hear. She did not need long. Provisional guardianship upheld. The petition by the Whitmores denied and noted for the record with grave concern about the petitioner's stated motives. And a recommendation entered formally that the permanent guardianship hearing looked most favorably on the current arrangement. Theo ran back across the courtroom, and Caleb caught him, lifted him clean off the scuffed floor and held on, and the boy buried his face in Caleb's shoulder, and Caleb held the back of his head with one hand the way you hold something you will never ever let fall. I've got you, Caleb whispered into the messy hair. You hear me? I've got you. The big half's yours. Always. That was the first war. The second one ended 2 days later. Because while Vincent Whitmore had been in family court watching his marriage and his scheme come apart over a story about bread, the 30-day clock had run almost all the way down, and Caleb had spent its final hours doing the last of the quiet work. The last day of all of this fell on a calendar that Vincent, even now, even after the courtroom, did not fully understand. Because Vincent was throwing a party. He always threw a party. It was his nature. A man who needed a stage. The annual Whitmore Holdings Charity Gala in the grand ballroom on the 39th floor of the tower downtown. Crystal chandeliers, live music, catered seafood and champagne, a guest list of investors and politicians, and half the city's business elite, and reporters, always reporters, because what was the point of being powerful if no one wrote it down? For Vincent, it was the perfect stage. He stood in the center of it all with a glass of scotch, laughing, accepting congratulations, the generous face of the family empire. The headlines were already half written in his head. Seattle's most powerful developer, the philanthropist, the lion of the city. He had no idea the floor was already gone from under him. Because in the weeks he'd spent swinging at a ghost in the daylight, the ghost had been working in the dark. And piece by piece, loan by loan, through a dozen quiet vehicles that never once said the name Caleb Mercer, more than half of Whitmore Holdings' vulnerable debt had quietly changed hands. It now belonged to a single private trust, Caleb's trust. And tonight the ghost was done being quiet. The ballroom doors opened at first without anyone noticing. Just a draft, just a shift in the music's hum. But conversation began to fade here and there as heads turned. A young man had walked in, tall, in a dark suit that fit like it had been made for him because it had. Hair neat, posture steady, his face calm in a way that drew the eye because calm was not what you expected from someone so young in a room like this. Caleb Mercer walked into the ballroom. For a moment, no one knew him. Then Vincent did, and the scotch glass paused halfway to his mouth, and the easy smile froze on his face, and something flickered behind his eyes that he had not felt in a very long time. Uncertainty. Caleb moved through the crowd without hurrying. The guests parted for him without quite knowing why. Behind him, a step back silent as ever, came Desmond Hart, and a few of the older guests, the ones who'd been around long enough, recognized the old lawyer and began quietly to understand that something was happening. Caleb reached the long table where several board members and major investors stood with their champagne. He set down a slim leather folder, and he opened it. "I believe," Caleb said, and his voice carried in the quieting room even unhurried. "Several of you will want to see this." Inside were the debt agreements, copies of them. Millions of dollars in loans once tied to Whitmore Holdings now transferred to a single private trust. Spelled out plainly, impossible to misread. A ripple moved through the gathered suits. Murmurs. A board member picked up a page, frowned, picked up another. Vincent crossed the room fast, the smile back on, switched on like a light. "What is this?" he said, and he made his voice amused, made it loud enough for the room. "Some kind of stunt." He looked at Caleb, and for the benefit of everyone watching, he laughed. "I'm sorry, do we even know this young man? You think buying up a few scraps of paper makes you somebody?" And Caleb looked at him, the man who had laughed at him across a marble table a month ago, the man who had tried to take a child off a table like a poker chip, the man who had destroyed his own brother for a building. Caleb did not laugh. "No," he said quietly. "Buying a few scraps of paper doesn't make me anybody." He let it sit. "But holding the majority of a company's debt makes me its largest creditor. And that," he looked at the board members, "makes me somebody you have to listen to." The words landed like a stone dropped in still water. The board members leaned in, flipped faster through the folder, and Desmond Hart stepped forward just slightly and spoke for the first time, his calm old voice cutting clean through the room. "Under the company's debt covenants and applicable restructuring provisions," Hart said, "a creditor holding this level of obligation has the standing to demand an emergency review of executive leadership." A pause. "Tonight, if necessary." Vincent's face changed, the amusement curdling into something else. But Caleb wasn't finished. Because the debt was the leverage. The debt was how he'd take the company. But the debt was not how he'd end the man. Caleb reached into the folder, and he slid a second set of documents onto the table. And these were not loan agreements. These were bank records. Wire transfers, account numbers, shell companies linked one to the next, offshore structures, dates and amounts, years of them, all tracing back in the end to one name. The gift from a man named Adrian Voss, who had a grown daughter and a guilty conscience and one decent thing left in him. These, Caleb said, and now his voice was not quite so calm, because some things you cannot say calmly, are records of money taken out of Whitmore Holdings, quietly, for years, diverted into shell companies, hidden offshore. Money that belonged to this company, to the people who work for it. to the projects it promised to build. He looked up, around the table, at every face. "Money my uncle stole," Caleb said, "from the company his own father built." And the room went silent. The kind of silence that presses on the ears. Phones came out, cameras. The reporters who had come for a puff piece about a generous lion of the city suddenly understood they were standing in the middle of something else entirely. The murmurs turned sharp. Board members stared at the offshore records with faces gone gray. Vincent Whitmore looked around the ballroom. At the guests, at the board, at the reporters, at the documents on the table that did not lie, could not lie because he had written them himself, every dirty number, because he had always believed the writing protected him. And he understood, all at once, the way a man finally understands the knife. The balance of power had shifted, not in a courtroom, not in a boardroom, here, in front of everyone, in the middle of his own party, on his own perfect stage. He turned to Caleb, and the mask was gone, now entirely gone, and what was underneath was just fury and fear. "Who are you?" Vincent said, low, almost a whisper. "Who the hell are you?" Caleb looked at him for a long moment. "Daniel Whitmore was my father," he said, and he watched the name hit Vincent like a physical blow. Watched the color drain out of the man's face. Watched the understanding arrive terrible and complete. "You buried him in your debt," Caleb said quietly. "You took everything from him. His name, his standing, his life. And you never thought about him again, did you? You never thought there might be anything left." A breath. There was. There was me. Vincent had no words. For the first time in his life, perhaps. No words at all. The emergency board meeting was held early the following Monday. The mood in the tower was nothing like the glittering gala. The same executives who toasted champagne sat stiff around the long conference table, now gray-faced papers in front of them. Lawyers everywhere. The federal authorities had already made their first quiet calls because stealing millions from a company is not a thing that stays quiet once the reporters have it. Caleb sat at the far end of the table beside Desmond Hart, and for the first time in his life, Caleb was not the outsider in the room. He was the one holding the leverage. But here is the thing he had not expected. The board did not simply hand it to him. Because the board members were frightened, and cornered animals, even well-dressed ones, do not always do the sensible thing. One of them cleared his throat and said what several were thinking. That yes, the situation with Vincent was untenable. Yes, change was necessary. But this young man, this 18-year-old who'd appeared from nowhere, surely he didn't expect them to simply hand a company worth billions to a boy with no experience, no track record, no... And Caleb let him finish. And then Caleb spoke. And he did not threaten them with the debt. He could have. The leverage was real and they all knew it. But Hart had taught him something over 30 days in a study in the mountains. Leverage gets you in the room. It does not earn you the room. So instead, Caleb told them what his grandfather had wanted. He told them about a man who'd built this company with his own hands, about a son who should have run it, who had judgment that couldn't be taught, who delivered bad news in a way that made you grateful. He told them, in his own words, that he did not want to run Whitmore Holdings himself, that he knew exactly how little he knew, that an 18-year-old had no business in that chair and he had no intention of sitting in it. What he wanted, he said, was simpler. He wanted the thief gone. He wanted the stolen money returned to the company it was taken from. And he wanted the company run going forward by people who remembered what it was supposed to be, for not a machine for making a few men rich, but something his grandfather had meant to leave better than he found it. "I'm not here to take it," Caleb told the board. "I'm here to give it back, to you, to the people who actually do the work. I just had to take it away from him first." And the room slowly began to turn. The vote did not take long after that. One by one, hands went up. Vincent Whitmore removed as chief executive of Whitmore Holdings, effective immediately. The matter of the diverted funds referred in full to the federal authorities, now reviewing the records Caleb had laid on the table. Vincent sat through it, watched the hands rise, watched the empire he'd believed he controlled stop belonging to him, one raised hand at a time. When it was done, he stood, violently, the chair scraping back. He pointed across the table at Caleb, and his voice shook with something between rage and disbelief. "You think this makes you better than me?" he snapped. "You think you've won something. You got lucky. You're a foster home. Nobody who got handed a dead man's money. That's all you are. That's all you'll ever, maybe, Caleb said. And the single quiet word cut Vincent off cleaner than a shout ever could. Caleb stood, and he reached into the inside pocket of his suit, the pocket over his heart, and he took out one folded dollar bill. Old, crease-soft at the folds, the same dollar. The one that had been slid across a marble table a month ago while a room full of strangers laughed. Caleb unfolded it, smoothed it flat, and he set it down gently on the conference table in front of Vincent Whitmore. "My inheritance," Caleb said. He looked at his uncle. There was no triumph in his face, only something quieter and older and sadder. "Don't spend it all in one place," Caleb said. And he turned and he walked out of the room the same way he'd walked out of that first one a month before. Steady, unhurried, his head up. Except this time the room was silent behind him for an entirely different reason. 6 months later, the world looked very different. Whitmore Holdings had steadied under new leadership aboard reshaped professionals Caleb had helped choose, and then deliberately stepped back from, because he'd meant what he said about not sitting in the chair. The stolen money, most of it recovered and returned. New programs underway, funded by a company that finally remembered what it was for. Housing, education, work for people who needed it. Vincent Whitmore was facing the long, slow grind of the courts. Eleanor had filed for divorce and quietly through her own lawyer had reached out to Caleb once. Not for forgiveness, she'd said she didn't expect that, but just to say that she was volunteering now at a children's home across the city and that she thought about the boy and the bread more often than he might believe. Caleb had read the letter twice, and then he'd written back 3 words. "Thank you, truly, because people could change." He had to believe that. The whole story fell apart if they couldn't. But Caleb himself was not living like a man who owned a piece of an empire, because that had never been the point. Most afternoons, if you wanted to find him, you'd find him in Tacoma, outside a building that had been a crumbling community center and was now something else entirely. Renovated. Bright. Warm. A place where kids from foster homes, kids with too big, watchful eyes, kids who'd learned too early how to read a room now had somewhere to go. To study, to play basketball, to eat a hot meal, to simply be for a few hours in a place that was warm and safe in theirs. The Daniel Whitmore Center. Named for a father Caleb had never met but understood now all the way down. And Theo ran across the grass out front, chasing a golden retriever. The center had adopted a goofy dog named Biscuit, who loved every child equally, and the bread crusts they snuck him most of all. The boy was laughing, really laughing. The kind of laugh that comes from a kid who has finally stopped waiting for the floor to fall away. The permanent hearing had gone through weeks back. Quiet, quick. The judge, the same tired, careful woman, had barely needed the file. Permanent guardianship granted. Theo was Caleb's, for good. On paper now, the way it had been true in every other way for a long time. The boy who got the big half. Kept. Desmond Hart stood beside Caleb on the steps, watching the kids play in the afternoon sun. The old lawyer looked Caleb, thought less like a man made of stone these days. Something had eased in him over these months. Some weight he'd carried for a dead friend finally set down. "Your grandfather would be proud," Hart said quietly. Caleb watched Theo tackle the dog into a pile of leaves. Watched a dozen other kids laughing on the basketball court. Watched a place full of children who for once did not have to worry about tomorrow. And he thought about it. Really thought about it. Whether his grandfather would be proud. The old man had asked him to take back a company, and he had. But that had never really been the inheritance, had it? Not the company, not the 50 million, not even the dollar. The inheritance was the choice, because Caleb could have kept it all, could have sat in the big chair, lived in the big house, become exactly the kind of man who held the big half for himself and told the world he'd earned it. The money had offered him that. Vincent had practically dared him into it. "You're just like me," the man had believed right up to the end. Everyone has a price. And Caleb had looked at all of it. The power, the revenge, the chance to make Vincent suffer the way Vincent had made his father suffer. And he'd set it down, gently, like a folded dollar bill on a conference table. Because the sweetest revenge had never been taking everything from the man who'd taken everything. The sweetest revenge was this. A warm building full of laughing children who would never grow up the way Caleb had. A boy with messy hair and a goofy dog in a future. A cycle broken. A cold thing finally made warm. Maybe, Caleb said softly, the same word he'd given Vincent, but it sounded different now. Lighter. Maybe he would. Theo looked up from the leaves, spotted Caleb on the steps, and his whole face lit up the way it did now, easy and bright, a kid who knew exactly where he belonged. "Caleb!" he yelled across the grass. "Come on, Biscuit likes you better when you got snacks." Caleb laughed, a real one, and he went down the steps into the warm afternoon toward the boy and the dog and the children and the whole bright life he'd built out of one folded dollar and a choice. Because that was the thing his grandfather had finally understood too late in a letter written by a cold fireplace. That had cost him 18 years and a son he never got back. That love isn't the thing you keep. Love is the thing you give away. The big half, every time. Even when you're hungry. Especially then. And somewhere Caleb thought wherever good men go, when the world is finally done, being unfair to them, a father he'd never met, and a grandfather he'd forgiven were watching a yard full of children laugh. And maybe, just maybe, they were proud. So here's a question before you go. If you suddenly had the power that Caleb had, all that money, all that leverage, the chance to make someone pay, what would you do with it? Would you choose to take everything? Or would you choose, like a hungry young man with a folded dollar, to give away the big half? Think about it. And if this story moved you, if you believe that the people who had the least can still choose to give the most, stay with us. Because there are more stories like this one coming. Stories about justice, about second chances, and about the quiet, stubborn kind of good that doesn't make headlines but changes everything. We'll see you in the next one.